When people come up to me and tell me that it's okay for me to eat a little bit of gluten, I swear they sound like gluten drug dealers. A little bit of gluten won't hurt. You'll be fine. One bite never hurt anybody. All the cool kids are eating gluten. Gluten isn't addicting. Your doctor will never know. Okay, so my doctor may never know, but my intestines will. In this video, we're going to talk about how much gluten is okay to eat on a gluten-free diet. And for those with celiac disease and gluten intolerance, the answer is basically none. Also, we need to get away from the question of how much gluten is it okay for me to eat and reframe that as how little gluten will make me sick. We shouldn't be asking what can I get away with, but how much do I need to avoid gluten? If you haven't yet watched my last video about just how much the gluten-free diet is not a fad for those with celiac disease and gluten intolerance, you should go watch that. I'll link it somewhere up there, and that'll really set the stage and help you understand what I'm talking about in this video. I am not a medical expert, so I reached out to my cousin who is in med school, who is therefore also not a medical expert because he's only a med school student, but he basically said that the only way for people with celiac disease to remain healthy is to avoid eating gluten. He specifically said gliadin, and gliadin is the part of gluten that's bad for those with celiac disease. But he also said if you wanted to continue to experience symptoms like IBS or irritable bowel syndrome and diarrhea, then go ahead and just keep eating gluten. Those with celiac disease, if they eat gluten, their immune system literally attacks their intestine, damaging their intestine. And the only way for them to heal is to follow a strict gluten-free diet. And if you don't follow a strict gluten-free diet and continue to eat gluten, then you will continue to experience symptoms and your intestines won't heal. So just how little gluten can make you sick? According to a research article published on the United States National Institute of Health website, on average, people that eat gluten eat 10 to 20 grams of gluten a day. The same research paper says for those with celiac disease, they can eat up to 10 to 50 milligrams of gluten per day. That's literally 1,000 times less than the average consumed by people that do eat gluten. To quickly show you what those weights look like in real life, we have here 10 milligrams up to 20 grams of gluten represented by powdered sugar, because there ain't no way I would do this with actual gluten. Over here, we have the 10 milligram. You can see that's a very small amount. And no, we weren't guessing at this. We actually used a scale that measures down to milligrams. Same thing with 50 milligrams, just a very small amount. And these measurements of 10 to 50 milligrams are not how much gluten those with celiac disease should eat, but how much they can safely tolerate before gluten consumption starts to cause symptoms. And then we also have 10 grams and 20 grams that show on average how much people that don't have to follow the gluten-free diet can eat in a day. You can see that is a lot more. And again, 10 grams is 1,000 times more than 10 milligrams. Something else that emphasizes just how little gluten can make somebody sick. In my last video, I mentioned that there are multiple countries that have a requirement for food that is labeled as gluten-free that it has to contain less than or equal to 20 parts per million gluten, or 20 milligrams per kilogram. In our day-to-day lives, we don't really comprehend how little gluten is 10 milligrams or 50 milligrams or less than 20 parts per million. There's no way for us to measure that, so we can't approach the gluten-free diet with an attitude of how much can I eat, but how much do I need to avoid this, because even just a little bit of gluten can still make us sick. So no, it is not okay for those on the gluten-free diet for medical reasons to eat even just one bite of cake or one cracker. That is still too much gluten. When we take this information and apply it to those with celiac disease eating gluten-free in the real world, that's when there is a little bit more nuances to this than just you should basically eat no gluten. And we'll get into that. In general though, there is consensus among doctors, dietitians, nutritionists, and people who are experts in celiac disease about a baseline of how strict we should be on a gluten-free diet. And in general, it's recommended that people with celiac disease avoid gluten cross-contact or gluten cross-contamination as much as possible. Gluten cross-contact occurs when something touches gluten and then touches your gluten-free food, or when gluten-containing food touches your gluten-free food. That is cross-contact, and is generally considered not safe for those with celiac disease. Some examples of that, if fries have been fried in the same fryer that also fries chicken nuggets, which are coated in bread that contains gluten, people with celiac disease should avoid those fries because they now contain gluten, because they were in the same oil that was also frying gluten. Toasters and toaster ovens are another place where gluten cross-contact easily happens, And it is advised that those with celiac disease should either use a dedicated gluten-free toaster, or you can even buy toaster bags and put your gluten-free food in those bags and then put those in the toaster, and that way your gluten-free food never actually comes in contact with the gluten. And you bet that I have 2 toasters. Here, I'll even show you. Okay, right there. Isn't that great? I'm not going to tell you which one is the gluten-free toaster, but you can probably figure it out. Is it this nicer one on the bottom, or is it this old rickety one on top that doesn't work that well? Let me know in the comments which one you think is the gluten-free toaster. And yes, we have 2 butter dishes, gluten-free and gluten-containing. I'm going to go sit back down now. Oh, that is not where we had it before. I think that's good-ish. So you don't actually need 2 butter dishes, you just need to be careful with cross contact. For example, if you're going to take butter and then spread it on gluten bread, and then take that knife and stick it back into the butter, that butter now has been cross-contacted with gluten and is therefore not really safe for those with celiac disease. You just need to avoid sticking that knife back into the butter or mayo or peanut butter or whatever it is the substance you're spreading after that knife has touched food that contains gluten. The reason that we have 2 butter dishes is because my wife wanted 2 of them, because my wife always gets what she wants. And then of course, if you're going to be making gluten-containing food on the counter, you'll want to clean that counter off and make sure it's free of all gluten before you start making gluten-free food. Otherwise, you'll end up with gluten cross contact and you could get sick. So all of this makes it pretty clear that despite what those gluten drug dealers say, it's really not okay just to eat a bite of gluten. Following the gluten-free diet starts to become a little more nuanced when we factor in how severe people's symptoms are when they eat gluten and how sensitive to gluten they are. For example, I in general seem to be less sensitive to gluten and have less severe symptoms than other people with celiac disease. So to some degree, I actually follow the gluten-free diet less strictly than those that have more severe symptoms and are more sensitive. I'm still avoiding cross-contact as much as possible, and I'm still very careful when I eat out, but I do allow gluten to be in my home because I feel comfortable with that as long as we make sure to clean up and that there is no just gluten particles around. But there are people with much more severe symptoms and that are much more sensitive to gluten who don't feel safe eating out at all because they've just gotten sick every time they eat out, and sometimes they don't allow gluten in their home at all. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying it's different for everybody. There isn't one way to follow the gluten-free diet for everybody. But in general, there are those consistent baselines of avoiding cross-contact with gluten as much as possible, and of course, not purposely consuming gluten of any kind. Last week, I made that video that showed that for those with celiac disease and gluten intolerance, the gluten-free diet really is not a fad. This week, I showed that it is not okay to eat a little bit of gluten on the gluten-free diet if you have celiac disease. Next week, I'm talking about how hard the gluten-free diet is for those who medically need to avoid gluten. And I'll link next week's video up here after it comes out. Peace.